The first thing you learn when working night security at the Nevada Desert Research Station is that the sand is never still. Even on calm nights with no wind for miles, you'll see it shift in slow, deliberate ripples like something breathing just under the surface. They don't put that in the job posting. The ad just said, overnight security guard needed, high clearance, hazard pay, confidentiality required. No mention of the isolation, no mention of the whispers. And definitely no mention of what happens if you forget the rules. The station is 40 miles from the nearest town, a cluster of squat concrete buildings surrounded by a double-layered fence. Officially, it's an environmental research facility. Unofficially, let's just say that after 2 years here, I still don't know exactly what we're guarding. My shift begins at sunset. The heat drains from the air quickly out here, the sky bleeding from orange into deep indigo. For about 10 minutes, the desert feels almost peaceful until the change happens. The wind dies, the night insects stop, and a low hiss begins to curl through the silence. I remember my first night clearly. That hiss drew me to the perimeter fence, my flashlight beam catching the pale shimmer of the sand. Then I saw it, a wide, slow-moving bulge sliding beneath the surface, circling the compound. Before I could call it in, my radio crackled to life. Gatehouse. Return to post. The voice was flat, emotionless, and not interested in questions. I went back. The next day, Chief, the station's head of security, handed me a laminated card. 6 rules printed in block letters. No explanations, no discussion. Just memorize these. You'll last here as long as you follow them. At the time, I thought it was all theater, some classified government paranoia to make the job feel important. Then, in my 3rd week, I watched what happened to a man who broke one. The 6 rules are simple enough to fit on one side of the card, but each one carries the weight of someone else's mistakes that don't get talked about out loud. Rule 1, never look beyond the perimeter fence after 2:17 a.m. Rule 2, if you hear your name spoken, do not answer unless the speaker is in your direct line of sight. Rule 3, keep the gate locked from sundown to sunrise. No exceptions. Rule 4, do not acknowledge anyone wearing a uniform older than yours. Rule 5, maintain radio contact every 30 minutes. Static means stay where you are. Rule 6, if the sand starts to move, go inside immediately. Chief didn't explain the times, the static, or the strange uniform rule. He just handed me the card, stone-faced, and said, break one and you won't have to worry about the others. At first, I thought he meant it as a scare tactic, a way to keep new hires from slacking off. I kept the card in my breast pocket, more out of respect for his authority than genuine belief. That changed in my 3rd week. It was a Tuesday night. The air was so still that the desert felt like a photograph, cold, sharp, silent. Stars hung low and bright enough to throw faint shadows across the ground. At 2:10 a.m., Carter, the new rookie, decided to step outside the gate for a cigarette. He left it unlatched, saying the desert felt too quiet and he wanted air that didn't smell like diesel generators. At 2:15, I heard it, the whispering. Louder than I'd ever heard it before, curling around us like wind through dry reeds. At 2:16, the sand about 20 feet from the gate began to bulge, a slow, deliberate swelling as if something massive was pushing up from underneath. By 2:17, Carter was gone, no scream, no struggle, just gone. His cigarette was still there, lying on the hard-packed dirt, glowing faintly in the dark. We didn't call the police. We didn't file a missing persons report. Chief just wrote personnel reassignment in the incident book, shut it with a snap, and told us to carry on. That was the night I learned 2 things. 1, the rules weren't suggestions. 2, whatever moves in the sand doesn't care if you believe in it. Last month, Chief told me we'd be hosting special guests. That was new. We never get visitors at night. He handed me an updated card, same 6 rules, but now with a 7th printed in the same heavy block font. Rule 7: if the guests arrive late, do not let them in. Late wasn't defined, I asked. Chief didn't blink. You'll know. The night they came, a dust storm rolled in around 11 p.m. The desert wind roared like a freight train, battering the perimeter fence, stinging my face with fine grit. The floodlights were still on, but the storm reduced them to pale, flickering halos that barely reached the ground. At exactly midnight, the first vehicle appeared, a matte black SUV, windows tinted dark enough to swallow the light. The driver's uniform was crisp, modern, and regulation perfect. He presented ID, matched the manifest exactly. I waved them through without a second thought. 7 minutes later, another SUV emerged from the swirling dust. Same make, same model, same uniforms, at least at first glance, but something was wrong. The headlights seemed dimmer, like the darkness itself was eating the beams before they touched the sand. The driver rolled down the window and smiled. His teeth didn't look human, too many, and each one needle sharp. "We're with the first team," he said. His voice, smooth but cold, got delayed. My gut turned to ice. 7 minutes late. Gates closed, I told him, tightening my grip on the latch. The smile didn't falter at first. "Open it, we're due inside." I remembered Rule 7 and stayed silent. That's when his smile dropped. For several long seconds, no one spoke. The only sound was the storm. Then behind the SUV, the sand began to ripple broad. Concentric waves spreading outward like something huge was circling beneath the surface. The headlights flickered once, twice, then steadied. My radio crackled with static so loud it buzzed in my teeth. I turned my back and walked to the gatehouse, shutting and locking the steel door behind me. My hands didn't stop shaking until I heard the engine idle for a minute, then fade into nothing. When the storm cleared an hour later, I checked the road. There were no tire tracks. No sign anything had been there at all. Over the next few nights, the desert grew restless. The whispering started earlier each evening, no longer waiting for the deep hours past midnight. Sometimes I could hear it before the sun was fully down, thin and curling under the wind, like someone murmuring just beyond my hearing, syllables breaking apart into dry, sifting sounds. On the 4th night after the late guests incident, I was doing my usual perimeter check when I spotted something in the floodlight's reach. Boot prints. They led away from the fence, angling off toward open desert. The sand around them was undisturbed, perfectly smooth except for those deep, sharp impressions. They ended abruptly mid-stride, as though the person had been plucked straight up into the air. No drag marks, no sign of return, and the tread pattern was unfamiliar, too narrow, the heel too pointed. After that, I began noticing more anomalies. The old radio tower at the north end of the compound had been decommissioned for years, its wires coiled and rusting, bird nests wedged into its steel joints. Yet at exactly 1:11 a.m., for 3 nights in a row, it began transmitting faint Morse code. I don't know Morse, but I wrote down the pattern: 3 short, 1 long, 2 short, and when I showed it to Chief, he just shook his head and told me to focus on my patrols. Then there was the gatehouse window. Late one shift, I caught sight of my reflection. Only it wasn't quite mine. The man in the glass was half a second behind my movements, his expression slightly off. Like he knew something I didn't. I tested it, lifting my hand, blinking twice, but the reflection would sometimes pause too long or smile when my own face stayed still. And the flagpole, that one got under my skin. On a night with no wind under a perfect full moon, I noticed its shadow pointing in the wrong direction, stretching toward the desert instead of back toward the compound lights. I told myself it was a trick of the angle, but the longer I stared, the more wrong it felt. As if the desert itself was pulling on it. Chief acted like none of this was unusual. but I saw the way his hands lingered on the new locks he was adding to the perimeter fence. Heavy padlocks, reinforced steel. He didn't explain, and I didn't ask. 2 weeks later, we had another visitor. She came during a windless, bone-dry night, a woman in a 1970s era Air Force uniform. The cut was old-fashioned, the patches sun-faded. I knew immediately it was older than mine, and Rule 4 flashed in my head. Do not acknowledge anyone wearing a uniform older than yours. She stopped just outside the gate, hands clasped neatly behind her back, and stared at me through the glass. Her hair was perfectly still in the dead air. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear, as though she was speaking underwater. I kept my face blank, didn't move. After 30 long seconds, she turned. The moment her body angled away, the edges of her form blurred, and in the space of a heartbeat, she dissolved into the air, gone, like smoke whipped away by a wind that wasn't there. I sat frozen for several moments, heart pounding, before forcing myself to log the incident. I'd barely finished writing when the whispering started again. Only this time it was different. It was louder, closer, and it wasn't coming from outside the fence. The sound rose from beneath the floorboards of the gatehouse, a chorus of dry, hissing voices pressed just under the wood. They spoke in unison, too fast, too layered to separate, like 100 conversations blighting into each other. The boards beneath my boots trembled faintly, as if something was shifting in the packed earth below. I reached for my radio, but the static drowned everything. The whispering swelled, the pitch rising until it pressed at my eardrums, and then just as suddenly it stopped. The silence that followed was worse. The floorboards began to tremble beneath my boots. The vibrations, faint at first, then building like a distant freight train. Dust drifted down from the rafters in lazy spirals, coating my desk and the coffee mug beside it. My radio hissed with static so loud it made my teeth ache. Then, cutting through the distortion, a voice. Gatehouse, open the fence. It wasn't Chief's voice. It wasn't anyone I knew. The tone was flat, too even, as if someone was reading the words without understanding them. The whispering I'd been hearing for weeks swelled into something else, no longer a hiss, but a rushing roar, like an oncoming sandstorm about to swallow the compound whole. The sound pressed against the walls, vibrating in my chest. Outside, the floodlights began to flicker. Once, twice. Then they failed entirely, plunging the perimeter into a darkness so complete it felt solid. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it across the yard. The beam cut through the black in a narrow cone. Catching the edge of the gate, that's when I saw it. Something was rising from the sand just beyond the fence line. It was humanoid mostly, but too tall, its proportions subtly wrong. The shoulders were narrow, the arms too long, the head tilted at an angle that made my stomach twist. The sand poured off it in sheets, hissing softly as it landed. I caught its face for only a second, but that was enough. The sockets where its eyes should have been were deep, hollow caverns. Not darkness, absence. Looking into them felt like staring into a place where light had never existed, a depth that could pull you in if you let your gaze linger. I understood Rule 1 in my bones: never look beyond the fence after 2:17 a.m. It called my name. The sound wasn't loud, but it pressed into me all the same, vibrating in my bones. Hearing it made me want to step outside, to unbolt the gate, to obey. I backed away from the window. Pulse pounding, my hand found the laminated rules card in my pocket. I gripped it hard, as if holding onto the words could somehow anchor me. The thing stepped closer. Despite the churned sand beneath its feet, it made no sound. Then I heard the outer gate latch rattle, once, twice, then slow, deliberate scraping metal on metal, as if someone was testing the lock. Something was inside the perimeter. The beam of my flashlight caught movement low to the ground near the storage shed's shadows that didn't match the shape of the buildings. They were crawling. wrong in their motion, jointed in ways no human limbs could bend. The radio crackled again, a different voice this time, sharper, more urgent. "Gatehouse, let them in." I didn't move. The latch rattled again, harder. A metallic creak told me the outer gate was opening. That wasn't possible. I'd locked it myself, checked it twice. The whispering roared into the gatehouse from every direction, inside my head and outside my skull at once. I could feel the floor vibrating under my boots, each tremor timed with a sickening pulse that seemed to come from the ground itself. Then, from the darkness beyond the yard, I saw shapes, 3, maybe 4, crossing the open space toward me. They moved with the precision of a patrol, but their bodies were wrong in the way the tall figures had been wrong. The lead shape's head twitched in tiny, rapid movements, as though it was sniffing the air. One of them stopped short and tilted its face toward me. Even from a distance, I could tell its eyes, or the absence of them, were the same as the thing beyond the fence. It spoke my name again, not out loud directly into my head. I staggered back, bumping into the wall. My flashlight slipped from my hand and clattered to the floor, the beam rolling and flashing across the ceiling. The radio screamed with static so violent it almost drowned out the pounding in my ears. I pressed my palms over them, shutting my eyes, reciting the rules under my breath. Rule 1, Rule 2, Rule 3. When I opened my eyes again, the window was filled with that tall, tilting silhouette. It was standing inches from the glass. The gatehouse door handle began to turn. I don't remember blacking out. One moment the door handle was turning, the next I was blinking against the pale light of dawn. My head ached in a way that felt deep. Not just in the skull, but behind my eyes, as though something had been pressing on my thoughts all night. The chief was standing over me, a steaming cup of coffee in one hand, watching me with his usual unreadable expression. "The cameras caught nothing," he said, setting the cup on the desk, "which means you followed the rules." I nodded, though my hands wouldn't stop trembling. My mouth was dry, my tongue heavy, like I'd been holding my breath for hours. Chief didn't linger on what I'd seen or thought I'd seen. He rarely did. Instead, he outlined the procedural adjustments they'd made: reinforced perimeter fencing, new locks on both gates, motion sensors buried in a ring around the gatehouse calibrated to detect ground-level disturbances. Then he handed me a fresh laminated rules card. The first 7 were the same, but at the bottom, printed in the same heavy black letters, was a new line. Rule 8, if you lose time, file your report before speaking to anyone. I stared at it, my fingers tracing the edge of the card. "How did you know He didn't answer, just met my eyes for a moment, then turned toward the door. That's the part that stays with me, not the silence, not even the implication, but the certainty in his face, as if he'd been expecting it to happen, as if it was inevitable. It's been 3 weeks since that night. The desert has been quiet, or at least quieter. No rippling sand, no flickering lights. No voices on the radio that don't belong, and yet the calm doesn't comfort me, because now I notice the small things. The way the air sometimes feels heavier, like the atmosphere itself is leaning in. The way the stars can seem too sharp, too close, as though they're hanging just above the perimeter. And on certain nights, when the wind dies completely and the silence presses against my ears, I could swear I hear my name whispered from somewhere out in the dunes. When that happens, I keep my eyes down. I count the minutes until 2:17 passes. I recite the rules in my head like a prayer, and I never ever open the gate after midnight. If you've ever worked a night shift in a place where the world feels empty, you already know how the dark can play tricks on you, how a shadow on the wall can look just a little too solid, how a faint sound in the distance can pull your attention long enough for you to forget what you were doing. But out here, in the desert, I've learned something I wish I didn't know. Sometimes it's not a trick. Sometimes the dark isn't just surrounding you, it's watching. I've got 8 rules now. I follow them without question, and I've seen what happens to people who don't. The rules aren't there to keep the job running smoothly, they are there to keep me breathing. So if you were in my position standing in a gatehouse at 2:17 in the morning with something on the other side calling your name, what would you do? Would you follow the rules or open the gate? Tell me in the comments, I read them. And I'm curious because I think most people believe they'd make the smart choice. But the truth, you don't know what you'll do until the moment comes. If you want to hear more of what it's like to work security in places that shouldn't exist, where the job description doesn't tell the whole story, make sure you subscribe. Turn on notifications, because the next shift, it can start any night, and when it does, you'll want to know the rules before you need them. And one more thing, if you've ever had your own rule at work, something no one could explain but everyone followed, share it. I think you'll be surprised how many of us have them. And some of those rules, they are older, stranger, and more dangerous than you think.